Appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. My name is Bob Sweeney. I'm an athletic trainer and vice president here with the U.S. Council for Athletes Health, and we are very pleased to bring this program to you as part of our partnership with the Big West and the conference office. So we're in our going into our second year with the conference, and Leslie and Commissioner Butterly have given us some great ideas on how to hopefully get you some presentations and content that will be of interest to you. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you Rachael Flatt. She is currently a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the University of North Carolina, and also a member of our advisory panel here with the U.S. Council for Athletes Health. Prior to transitioning to the University of North Carolina, she served as the programs director for the Center for M2 Health at Palo Alto University and worked on several projects through both Stanford University and Palo Alto University. Rachael graduated from Stanford in 2015 with a bachelor's degree in biology and a minor in psychology. An accomplished athlete, Rachael also placed 7th in the 2010 Olympic Winter Games in ladies figure skating and was the 2010 U.S. national champion and the 2008 World Junior champion. Rachael retired from competitive skating in 2014 and continued to play an active role in the sports community as an athlete representative for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee's Mental Health Task Force, U.S. Figure Skating's Board of Directors, and as U.S. Figure Skating's chair of the Athletes Advisory Committee. Rachael's long-term interests include furthering eating disorder research and digital mental health technology through program optimization and tailored treatments for high-risk and underserved populations, including athletes. And with that, I give you Rachael Flatt. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. That's quite the intro. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all. Thanks so much for joining this evening. I'm very, very excited to be speaking with you all. Like Bob said, we're going to be doing kind of a 45-minute presentation around mental health. And so we'll just be kind of doing some broad strokes on a number of topics tonight. But before we get started, I did want to just briefly say, if y'all have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat as we're going through this presentation, or just raise your hand. I really love when folks interact a little bit more, and so please don't hesitate to add questions to the chat, or concerns, or comments, all that good stuff. And if at any point you feel like you need to leave because some of the topics that we're talking about feel a little bit triggered, totally okay. Just want to make sure that y'all feel comfortable. So with that, we'll get started. As a brief intro, outside of what Bob had mentioned, I actually grew up in Southern California and have very strong roots in San Diego, and was a typical Southern California kid. Grew up surfing and playing all the outdoor sports, but somehow got stuck in an ice rink and fell in love with skating. And that ended up taking me to the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. So I, like you all, have a very strong athletic background. And because of a lot of my experiences in sport, really thought that it was going to be essential to bring better mental health treatments to athletes and really raise awareness and decrease the stigma around athlete mental health. So that really brought me to getting my clinical psychology PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm very excited to be defending my dissertation at the end of this week. But I was also a graduate of Stanford, as Bob had mentioned, met my husband there, and outside of school and athlete mental health, we spent a lot of time outdoors. So I really wanted to mention those things in large part because I do think it's important to recognize and just share that, after we retire from sport, there's all sorts of things that life has to offer. And, just like we prioritize our physical health when we're competing in sports, to make sure that we have a lot of longevity in our lives physically afterwards, I think we really want to start kind of using the same type of perspective when it comes to our mental health. One of the main reasons why I really got into researching and providing services for athletes and their mental health is because I really believe that athletes shouldn't be at greater risk of developing mental health concerns. because of being in sport. And so I really feel passionately about working as a community to make sure that the sports environment, especially at an elite level, especially at the elite college level as well, can really be a model for mental health more broadly. We've obviously got a long ways to go to get there, but I really hope that at least parts of this talk will allow you to feel a little bit more inspired or feel like you have some more resources, or just feel a little bit more equipped to navigate your own mental health. So I'm very excited to be sharing a little bit of this with you today. So in terms of what we'll be covering, I'll be talking very briefly around the importance of mental health. So this will be a good question for you all. So get your answers ready in terms of why mental health is important to you. And then we'll be spending some time kind of talking about the spectrum of mental wellness to illness, what some of the common signs and symptoms are of mental health concerns, and some of those specific sport-related considerations that are really helpful to keep in mind. And then a little bit of information about things to think about when seeking treatment, whether that's you or someone else, in crisis management. And then if you're wanting to help out, like how can we do that? And then I'll wrap this up with a couple of resources at the tail end. So hopefully we get through it all. But if you all have questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll stop along the way to make sure I'm answering those. So I would love to start with just an open-ended question to you all, and feel free to unmute or put your answers in the chat. I would be really curious to hear a little bit about why you care about mental health. Why is this important to you? So I'll go ahead and put myself on mute for a second, and feel free to unmute or raise your hand. Go for it, Natalie.
Well, myself and a lot of people I know have struggled with mental health issues. And I know for a fact that I wouldn't have been able to get through my mental health problems without the support of friends and family. So it's really important to me that conversations about mental health are destigmatized enough that people feel comfortable getting help.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Yeah, that is so important. I think it really a testament to like why we're all here today. Thank you so much. Jay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, mental health. As I get older, I'm starting to realize the importance of quality of life, and I know my mental stability, mental health is directly correlated with my quality of life. So, like I said, as I get older and life continues to happen, I try to make it a point to really focus on my mental health, whatever that entails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great points. Thank you so much, Jay. I think one of the things that can happen often as athletes, right? It's really easy to kind of put that on the back burner, especially as as college athletes. There's a lot on your plate. But yeah, I very much appreciate that sentiment. Well, thank you so much for raising your hands and sharing why mental health is important to you. I mean, I think there's a wide variety of reasons why mental health is important for a lot of different folks. And I think as we go through, oh, there we go. As we go through a lot of the media that we're consuming, and even just talking with peers and other researchers, clinicians, et cetera, like it is just so clear that mental health is really a top priority among student athletes. I've included some of the headlines here from recent articles. It's just really pervasive issue that has just been kind of brushed under the rug for a long time. So I think it's really important for us that we recognize that student athletes are calling out for help, are wanting this to be a priority, and yet this is something that we still have quite a ways to go on. In addition to that, I think when we're just looking at the numbers, we've got a third of college students experiencing pretty significant symptoms of depression, anxiety, or other mental health concerns. And of that 33%, we've got only 30% of students who are not athletes seeking help. And so much fewer athletes, only 10% of college athletes are actually seeking help. In large part, we see student athletes tend to underreport their mental health concerns. And there's a much greater stigma among student athletes as well around seeking help. So I think those are two of the primary barriers as to why folks are not getting the help that they need when they need it. So again, some additional numbers on the right here. You've got almost 160,000 student athletes with mental health concerns from the NCAA. And the large majority of student athletes have said that mental health really needs to be a priority. So again, it's very clear here. We need to prioritize this, and we need to provide better services and better resources. But a large part of that is just really initiating these conversations and ensuring that when people need help, that there is support that is appropriate and adequate. A couple other numbers here that are worth highlighting from the 2021 NCAA survey. A quarter of male and 50% of female athletes feel overwhelmed. And those numbers certainly went up during the pandemic. And there were nearly double the rates of mental exhaustion, anxiety, and depression as COVID continued, and that's been relatively sustained since then. And I think this is very telling as well. About half the athletes believe that their coaches take their mental health seriously or feel that their athletic department prioritizes their mental health, and only half feel comfortable seeking support from a mental health provider. So again, it's just painting this picture that even though this is a significant priority and a top concern for a lot of student athletes, there isn't necessarily the environment or the community fostered on college campuses or within an athletics department sometimes that makes them feel like they're really supported in their mental health. So again, like one of the things that we will be considering and talking a little bit about is how to foster a better culture and how to destigmatize mental health. So when we're thinking about mental health generally, I like to think about it as a spectrum, right? You've got mental wellness to mental illness. And I really want to focus on the mental wellness piece first before we start talking about some of the things related to mental health concerns and how that might show up. So on the mental wellness side, it's really important to think about this as not simply the lack of a mental health disorder. It's far more than that. One of the models that I really like is the 6 factors of psychological well-being, which include a sense of autonomy and growth and having really positive relationships, being able to achieve a sense of mastery, and having self-acceptance and purpose. So all of those kind of constructs and ideas really go beyond just the idea that there's no mental health disorder present, right? Each of those kind of groups is really telling in terms of how we think about mental wellness. It also, in a sports context, really encompasses psychological safety and resiliency. So your ability to bounce back when there are hiccups or if something, surprisingly negative comes up, or if there's a significant loss and there's grief, but being able to demonstrate some resiliency from issues that might occur. And it, again, also exists on a continuum. So one of the things that I really like to show folks is this idea of how we might consider mental health specifically on a continuum. On the left, we've got kind of this normal functioning and healthy side where you're looking at normal mood fluctuations and a generally good attitude, right? And feeling in control, having, good sleep patterns and being physically well and active. And, not necessarily having any significantly concerning behaviors. And when you're kind of in that zone, it's really important to prioritize self-care and social support. And those are typically the types of supports that you need in the event that something happens and you need a little help. On the other end of the spectrum, right, where you've got mental health disorders, you can certainly read through those there, but there's a lot of different things that might be observed in terms of mood or sleep or activity and habits, right, that can really be indicative that someone is needing much more substantive professional care. So again, there's a lot of variety and diversity when it comes to how this continuum will look for a person or for a student body or even within a team. And sometimes this will change for an individual over the course of their lifetime, right? There's going to be different needs over time. So it's really important to just be mindful of how kind of this continuum may change over time. These are some basic strategies to maintain mental wellness, and I'm sure this is not new to you all. But at a basic fundamental level, one of the best things that we can do for our mental wellness, we kind of categorize this into a please skill, where we're treating physical illnesses and taking medications as prescribed, maintaining a balanced eating and regular eating habits. Avoiding mood altering substances just so that your mood is better regulated, maintaining your sleep and getting good exercise. So again, these are kind of typical recommendations, right? It's not not rocket science here, but sometimes it's really easy to let some of these things go, especially when you've got a really demanding school schedule or travel schedule, and it can be very easy to let one or multiple of these aspects slip. So now that we've established kind of this idea of what mental wellness might look like, right? I want to switch gears and kind of go to this other end of the spectrum related to signs and symptoms of common mental health concerns in athletes. And since we've talked a little bit about what mental wellness looks like, I want to start with one of the most common things that we see in student athletes, which is anxiety. So in terms of some of the symptoms that we might see, I'll scroll through some of these here. This is an overwhelming sense of panic or feeling really nervous or apprehensive. You might experience racing thoughts or a lot of physiological changes related to an increased heart rate or breathing. You might have some sweating that's happening, or tremors or shaking, or having an upset stomach or nausea. Those are all very, very common symptoms. And I'm sure if you've ever been nervous before an event or a presentation, you probably know what anxiety feels like, or if you're kind of feeling a little bit panicked before a major test, that's probably what you've experienced. So anxiety is certainly something that most folks have experienced in their lifetime. But in terms of what we should do for anxiety, and these are some of the things that we often do in therapy, there's a whole host of techniques here. And these are certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that we'll do are relaxation techniques or grounding techniques where, for instance, you might kind of push your heels into the floor or turn your attention to something that's in front of you. You might also engage in breathing techniques. So this is one of my favorite gifts on the side. And yes, I stand by the fact that it is pronounced gifts, but it's a really nice breathing triangle to breathe with as you're inhaling, as it's expanding. And then when it's closing down, that's when you exhale. We've got a lot of mindfulness techniques. And especially with anxiety, it's very, very common to have a lot of anxious thoughts, like I'm worried if something like this might happen, or ruminating on if there are folks who, maybe have seen you mess up or something, right? Challenging those thoughts and trying to bring a more balanced perspective into play is essential there. And one of the other things that we'll often do with folks is really try to evaluate if anxiety is actually driving like the actions and the behaviors that you're taking. So for example, if you're feeling really anxious as you're out on the field and it's really taking your concentration away from the game and it's kind of bringing you into engaging in some behaviors that are really not consistent with the performance that you want to be providing for your team. One of the essential things that we do there is trying to identify if anxiety is actually driving those actions. And then if it is, getting you into a zone where you're more present and focused on what exactly you want to do at that moment. And again, if it feels like the anxiety is really impairing your performance, or if it feels like it's really distressing or it's getting in the way of a lot of the things that you want to do on a daily basis, like get some professional help. One of the additional most common mental health concerns that we see among student athletes is depression. And I've got this lovely little picture of sadness from Pixar's Inside Out, which I think perfectly encapsulates how depression feels sometimes, where it's just really significant sadness or frequent crying. You might see folks who are feeling hopeless or worthless or empty. They might be withdrawing and isolating from their friends or their teammates or their families. There might be this overwhelming sense of guilt. Sometimes folks will experience decreased appetite or unexplained weight loss, and sometimes it also swings the opposite direction as well. But more often than not, we'll often see folks who have issues with sleep as well. One of the more common symptoms that we'll see is something called anhedonia, which is really based around like this decreased interest in the things that you love. So specifically for athletes, you might see a real decrease in interest in their sport or other activities, and a lot of difficulty with concentrating or loss of energy or just feeling tired all the time. And it isn't all that uncommon for folks to also experience like thoughts of suicide or thoughts of harming themselves. So it's really important that when depression comes up in particular, that we're addressing those things pretty pertinently. With suicide risk factors, especially with student athletes, especially with a lot of the high profile cases that have occurred over the last several years. This is really common in mental health disorders, especially depression or bipolar disorder. We also see suicide and eating disorders pretty frequently as well. Some of the risk factors that we'll see are previous suicide attempts or feelings of extreme hopelessness or isolation, which certainly was increased during COVID just because of the lockdowns. If you have easy access to lethal means or really poor environment for seeking health or seeking help, or access to mental health providers, these are some of the main risk factors that we see among student athletes. So one of the best things that we can do here is get these folks into care as quickly as possible. And I'll share a few techniques and strategies and resources later on about how to address this in the moment. In terms of how we usually work on depressed mood, one of the best things that you can do is what we call activate yourself. So activate as much as you can get yourself up and out of bed, and doing even just some basic tasks of, taking a shower, doing your laundry, like sending an email if you can, just getting yourself to the field and going for a light jog. It's really just about getting those small moments of activation. And with that, really prioritizing things that provide a sense of enjoyment and a sense of achievement. So for instance, on the enjoyment side, if getting outside and, being in nature, and like for me, going camping, that is something that provides a real sense of enjoyment. On the achievement side, doing things that, even if it's just like being able to check something off your to-do list, like doing laundry or taking a shower for the day, all the way up to, maybe winning a national championship, right? Like those are things that can also really help support folks with building some resiliency in their mood and decreasing their depression. Oftentimes we'll also see folks with depressed mood who have a lot of negative thoughts about themselves, a lot of hopelessness, a lot of negative thoughts around self-worth. So being able to either rely on some friends or family to help challenge some of those negative thoughts early on, especially if that feels difficult, and then being able to do that for yourself and really challenging those thoughts. That's an essential part of addressing depression for a lot of folks. And then one of the other things as well that we really try to do is make sure that folks are reaching out for social support, because it's so easy when you're feeling sad and lonely to just continue to withdraw. So trying to take those initial steps to reach out for your support and get your friends or family involved are really important to reducing the depressed mood. And then finally, like I said, for anxiety, if it's something that feels, that is really distressing you or really impairing your daily life, like this is a really important thing to get some professional help on early and often. One of the other common mental health concerns that we'll see in athletes are eating disorders or disordered eating. So with disordered eating, this is really centered around some core behaviors related to binge eating or compulsive or excessive exercise. We'll also see student athletes vomiting or engaging in laxative use after meals or restricting their intake quite a bit. All of those types of behaviors will also come up in eating disorders. Eating disorders are just a more severe kind of version of disordered eating in a way. With both of these kind of categories, we'll often see folks have a really poor relationship with food, and that can show up in a number of different ways, whether that's like saying that I can only eat this very specific kind of foods, a lot of rigidity, or there may even be some rules around, only being able to eat these specific dietary requirements that aren't necessarily related to an underlying health condition. With athletes, we'll often see what's called orthorexia, where athletes are really focused on just eating very, very healthy and clean foods. We'll also see a lot of poor body esteem, so having a pretty poor relationship with your body. We'll see folks who are only eating alone because there might be a lot of shame experience there, and engaging in some body checking behaviors or intense weight and shape concerns or body comparisons. And there may also be intense fear of weight gain related to that as well. One of the things that often comes up with athletes in particular that is a little bit tricky is that I think eating disorders in particular are often associated with folks who are very thin or have had a lot of recent weight loss. And unfortunately, because of the demands that we have with training or with being an athlete more generally, it can be a little bit harder to miss if and when that does occur. And sometimes athletes are at a weight or a BMI that is pretty normal. So these can be a little bit sneaky illnesses. And so it's really important that mental health professionals are screening for this often. And then finally, we'll also see more frequent injuries in folks who have eating disorders simply because their bodies are not getting the nutrients that they need on a routine basis. So for eating concerns more generally, one of the things that we really try to emphasize in treatment is just getting folks to eat more regular meals. So typically the recommendation is at least 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks a day. And now obviously that's going to depend a little bit and change a little bit depending on your specific needs as an athlete, but the more routine and the more regularity that you can get into, so kind of getting away from that rigidity and building in a little bit more flexibility within that structure is going to be really important. To address a lot of the body image concerns, we also really recommend that folks minimize their social media use and try to shift away from their focus on their weight and shape to the things that are really important to them in their lives. So when folks are coming in for treatment, oftentimes they will say, 60 to 70% of my time, for instance, is taken up by thinking about my weight or my shape or my food. And that's not really what I want to be doing. Instead, we start trying to shift that around a little bit to ensure that they are really starting to focus on the things that are important to them, like their academics or their sport or their friends or their family. We also try to get folks to really avoid what we call fat talk and body shaming. So this is really just trying to get folks to start changing their language and how they relate to themselves and how they speak about others' bodies or physiques. And especially with these mental health concerns, we really want to make sure that folks get professional help. And it's a combination of working with usually a therapist, a dietitian, and a physician, since these are more complicated illnesses. So those are kind of the 3 main mental health concerns that come up in student athlete populations. that I wanted to briefly touch on and just give a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we do in therapy just to help them out. And with that in mind, I really wanted to spend kind of the remainder of this time really thinking about what some of the sport-related considerations are and how we navigate these concerns on college campuses and the sports community more broadly. So in terms of the sport-related risk factors, there's a lot here, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that we often see are for folks who do have an increased risk of developing a mental health disorder. We see folks who are specializing in their sports early, and sometimes that ends up being related to increased injury risk, or not necessarily having other parts of their lives kind of built out in a more substantive way that kind of prevents mental health concerns and provides a little bit more resiliency. We'll also see these personality traits that are very commonly found in elite athletes and mental health disorders. So I am definitely one of these folks that has some perfectionistic tendencies. I think that's very common for a lot of athletes who are successful. And so oftentimes we'll also see something like perfectionism that comes up often for folks who have anxiety or eating disorders as well. In addition, I'm sure you all have either seen or have experienced traumatic injuries on the field or on the courts. This is something that a lot of athletes deal with during their careers and is very closely tied to developing or increasing your risk for an eating or for a mental health concern, especially related to experiencing depression or anxiety or even an eating disorder after the fact. There's obviously a tremendous sense of loss if you have to take off like 6 months from your training, or if that impacts your sports career in a significant way. There's very often some intense emotions that come up with that, and that can sometimes lead into a mental health concern that comes up. Athlete identity is also something that is very commonly associated with an increased risk in mental health concerns. And I'll spend a little bit more time talking about that in a few slides, but generally speaking, this is kind of the extent to which someone identifies as an athlete. So, oftentimes when we introduce ourselves, we're like, yep, I'm a basketball player, or in my case, I'm a figure skater, right? And instead, when that identity is really strongly tied to who you think you are, it can definitely increase the risk of a mental health concern, especially as you're transitioning out of sport. There's also a lot of risks when you're engaged in a negative environment, especially when it's coming from coaches, when they're providing negative comments or behaviors towards you or your team. Participating in a leanness sport or a weight class sport can also really increase your risk. And as we know, especially with social media deals and NIL deals that are coming up too, we typically see a lot of objectification of athlete bodies. So that can definitely increase the risk of both anxiety and eating concerns. And then finally, one more thing I'll mention here too is that there's just an elevated stigma around mental health in sports, and a lot of that kind of comes from this idea that just like with physical injuries, where there was this kind of idea around not being able to show any weakness, that same idea has translated to physical or to mental concerns. And so being able to really deconstruct and knock down that stigma so that folks are getting help when they need it is going to be essential to reducing the risk. Couple additional notes here related to athletic identity. Like I mentioned before, this is kind of the degree to which an individual identifies with being an athlete. And oftentimes that also entails really looking to other people for acknowledgement of that role. And so one of the things that we'll do here with folks is kind of coming up with values charts. And this is even something that you can do now or later today or share with your friends. One of the things that we'll do is spend some time kind of sketching out a pie chart of the components of your life that are important to you. So this is a brief example of my recent values chart. Certainly prioritizing family and friends and my schooling and my career. Also spend a lot of time getting outdoors and prioritizing my self-care and mental health. I'm also engaged in a lot of extracurriculars, and we're working on some home improvement stuff too. And there's in that miscellaneous bucket, a whole slew of other things that we could put there. Obviously, since I'm not competing anymore, sports isn't on there. But for someone who has a really high athletic identity, we'll typically see a very large proportion of that pie chart as taken up by their sports career. And so when that happens, if you say have a tough season or you get injured, and that is like the core foundation of your identity, definitely makes sense that you're going to be at greater risk of developing a mental health concern when things might be going poorly, right? So what we want to try and do is ensure that we're kind of providing a little bit more balance for these folks. And, with these other categories like family, friends, and self-care and school, we're trying to shift that back so it's a little bit more balanced. In addition to that, one of the other things that I'll briefly mention too, related to social media, is that we know from all these reports that have come out recently and a lot of the research that there are a lot of signs that social media might be impacting your mental health. And I'll let you read these here, but I think one of the main things that, especially with being collegiate athletes and being potentially high profile folks in your sports, it's very common to experience cyberbullying. So I think it's really important to just be mindful of your social media usage and really trying to be intentional about if and how you are using these platforms. Certainly there can be a lot of benefits with engaging with fans, or certainly financially, like getting sponsors and being able to monetize that. And at the same time, it's just really important that you think clearly and proactively about your relationship with social media so that it doesn't worsen or kind of trigger some other mental health concerns. In addition to some of those risk factors, right, the things that are increasing your risk of developing a mental health concern, there are also some mental health triggers, so things that might lead to the onset of mental health concerns that are related to sports that are worth mentioning. One of those things is definitely poor sport performance. So just like I mentioned with athletic identity, if that is something that is really important to you and you have a poor performance, like that is going to hit so much harder than if there's a little bit more balance in your life. In addition to that, if there's personal conflict with teammates or coaches, or if there's an injury or an illness that's affecting your sports participation or decreased playing time, certainly those things can trigger the onset of a mental health concern. And one of the things that we're getting a lot more research on is as student athletes are retiring, we're actually seeing kind of an uptick in some mental health concerns. And now that's still a pretty new area of research in many ways, but we're still seeing some shifts in how mental health concerns can come about because of that retirement. Similarly, if you're feeling really burnt out on your sport or you're just not interested in participating anymore, and you're feeling like you have to keep going, right, especially with those expectations, it can be really hard to sustain your mental health in that scenario. So those are definitely some of the specific triggers that we often see that are worth just kind of keeping on your radar, so that it doesn't come as much of a shock if mental health concerns kind of come or if there's an onset of mental health concerns during some of these phases. As we're kind of thinking about mental health generally, it's really important for us to think about the negative impacts of mental health disorders on sport performance, which again are, hopefully should serve as a motivation to get some additional help. You've got poor concentration and worsened ability to really have good executive functioning in your brain. That is also associated with impaired judgment. So if you're thinking about being really anxious as you're heading into a test, it's often harder to make informed judgments. It's the same idea when you're out on the field. You'll also see decreased coordination sometimes, depending on the mental health disorder that's coming up. But pretty much across all mental health concerns, we'll see a lot of irritability or poor interpersonal functioning that comes up. In addition to that, low motivation as well. Fatigue and low energy can come up often. And usually what ends up happening is that there's a worsened training response when you're not mentally well. We can also see some direct physical impacts on your endurance and muscle strength. And we can also see a much greater risk of severe injury, and especially in the cases of suicidal ideation or eating disorders in particular, increased mortality risk as well. So there's a lot of negative impacts. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I hope that, these can serve as motivations to really get help. Or if you are noticing some of these things in some of your peers, that hopefully you can refer them out and get some additional support. So all that to say, the TLDR is that we just need to really improve athlete mental health and ensure that we're very clear on what to look for. And hopefully just with some of those overviews, you have a little bit better sense of some of the things that we might do to help support athletes when they are struggling with mental health. A couple things that I will mention. How am I doing on time? Okay, I might speed through some of these slides here at the end. But one of the things that I really wanted to mention briefly is that when you're seeking help, it is really important to have a good sense of when to refer or when to get help. So if someone's telling you they need help, or if you feel like they're kind of indirectly telling you that you need some help, or if you're noticing some significant changes in your mood or behavior, or someone else, or references to suicide, like those are very, very good indicators to get some help. Sometimes this is also seen as physical distress or making complaints that seem to have no apparent cause. So it might seem a little bit more confusing, and that may also be an indicator of a psychosomatic disorder. And also if there's been any traumatic events or traumatic changes, especially in personal relationships, whether that's with the team or coaches or staff members, those are really good indicators that someone should be getting some help. And then if there's any drug or alcohol abuse or struggling with academics beyond just kind of the typical adjustment period, especially if you're taking some new classes or switching majors or what have you. When it comes to treatment, there's often a lot of questions around like, who should I see and for what? Right? There's a lot of different types of providers out there. So between psychiatrists who typically offer more of the medication management side and some psychotherapy, to clinical and counseling psychologists, for example, who tend to offer more therapy services related to specific mental health concerns, to sports psychologists who really offer help and support around kind of the mental performance side of things. There's a whole slew of different mental health care providers, and that in and of itself can be really confusing. So if you do have questions, like be sure to go ask the folks at your college counseling services or the athletics department, just to get a better sense of who is an appropriate provider and for what. There's also a lot of different levels of care of therapy. Most people are most familiar with outpatient services. So if you're just seeing someone, in their office on a weekly or biweekly basis, but there's all sorts of levels of care ranging all the way up to residential and being hospitalized on an inpatient psychiatric unit. And those are for folks who tend to be quite ill. There's also lots of different kinds of therapy. So I put as an example, like CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. different types of strategies used within each of those therapies, and different modes of offering therapy, whether that's virtual or in person or in groups or as an individual or even couples therapy. But I think if there's one takeaway, the most important thing is really just to find someone who provides really high quality evidence-based services and has training in the thing that you are struggling with. So for instance, my background primarily is in working with athletes with eating disorders. So I try to see folks who have those concerns instead of seeing folks who, for instance, have bipolar disorder. That's not necessarily my area of expertise. So it's really important to find folks who have those specific training areas. And then when it comes to kind of managing a crisis, there's certainly a lot of different techniques that can be used, whether that's like getting your hands or your face in some ice for 30 seconds several times, or doing a really brief and intense stint of exercise, or some deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation. There are certainly things that you can help do in the moment to kind of navigate that crisis. And then on the other hand, when you're actually getting some help, which is essential in those moments, like use the emergency action plan if you are familiar with it. Everyone is required to have that. If you're in NCAA school, you can also call campus hotlines or call 988 or 911. You can use the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the crisis text line, or, if for some reason none of those are available, just call a family member or a friend just to try and help get some support. So as we're rounding this out, I think one of the most important things as we're thinking about how can we help, right? It is really just about changing the culture of mental wellness and mental health. And then it's not a single group of people, it's not a single group of athletes that can change the culture around mental health. This is something that everyone in the community has to be a part of. And so the more that we can empower athletes to access mental health resources and destigmatize mental health, the more that we will create a more positive culture and supportive culture around mental health and mental wellness. That absolutely necessitates having an inclusive environment and making sure that folks have proper training and education and support. One of the things that we're often working on the digital mental health tech side is trying to remove barriers to getting treatment. So if you have an app or have some even just website resources that are easily accessible so that folks can get more equitable access to care, that is a huge positive when it comes to getting folks some additional support and being able to do so when they need it in real time, and destigmatizing mental health even further. Relatedly, one of the things that we often focus on college campuses in particular is just trying to continue to decrease the stigma. And as I'm sure you all are pretty familiar with, it seems like there are different levels of talking of stigma and talking about mental health concerns, even within a team. So one of the things that we really try to do is focus on the education and avoiding really stigmatizing and negative words around mental health. We want to emphasize kind of appropriate sleep and rest and just basic self-care. And also providing a safe space to talk about mental health, and even just acknowledging that the stigma might exist. Again, like as we're talking through this, and as I mentioned earlier today in describing some of these mental health concerns, if you recognize that you or someone else are struggling, or if it feels impairing or distressing in any way with any of those symptoms, like it is super important to get that help. So even as you're talking with your friends or your peers or staff, the more that you can speak to the importance of seeking help, that also is a really important factor in decreasing the stigma around mental health. There's also some great mental health best practices up on the NCAA's website. And I'll skip through this real quick since we're just about out of time, and I do want to save some time for questions. But two last things that I'll mention here. USCAH has a fabulous series of mental health education modules that are designed specifically for student athletes and coaches and staff to really raise awareness of mental health topics and to highlight some specific areas of focus. So please feel free to check that out. And here are some of the specific courses, some of the things that we've talked about briefly today, just in terms of anxiety and depression, talking about injuries and EAPs or emergency action plans, some recovery techniques and mindfulness and resiliency. So lots of great information there. So I highly encourage you to go check those out, especially knowing that so few athletes do seek help. We're really trying to make sure that there's increased accessibility here.